middle-income countries. As I said, I'm more than happy to see you here in person. It's also time for your question now. I mean, we are a little bit tired of these back-to-back video meetings, aren't we? I hear a little bit of a nod. Yes. So this is also your time, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions in different panel rounds. As we talk, of course, with the private sector, we're gonna ask ourselves, what's the bridge from public to private within the key question that I just mentioned, and what is the role and the view of governments? So if you have a question, let me know. Send me the hand sign, or ladies and gentlemen in the live stream, just give me a hand raise so I can see that you have a question or a comment. We'd like to hear more today about the challenges and the opportunities when it comes to, as we call it, resilient, when it comes to sustainable infrastructure as an important foundation for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, but also, of course, looking ahead of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. So, as I mentioned, and as you could see the program, there are some packed hours ahead of us. Let's get started, and I warmly welcome now the first speaker and the first guest, of course, State Secretary of the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, Jochen Flassbart.
Thanks a lot, moderator. And also for me, it's wonderful to see you all here in person. And as you said, we are really hungry to see and chat with each other also outside the virtual facilities. And what we did over the last 2 years was basically that we were building up on our social capital that we gathered in former times, but every now and then we need to fill our batteries, see that we are real persons interacting, and at the end, I think it will be easier also to find common ground on different issues. So, dear representatives and colleagues from our G7 family, let me call it like that, dear representatives and colleagues from our partner countries, South Africa, Senegal, India and Indonesia, representatives from the multilateral development banks and of the private sector, and finally, your dear colleague, State Secretary Jörg Kukis. I don't know when we met the last time in person because we are organizing our governmental work also more or less constantly virtual nowadays. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, a warm welcome to this to Berlin here. Those who are present here with a wonderful view over the rooftops of Berlin. One of the key positive developments for me personally, my former Ministry for Environment, I had offices and conference rooms just locked inside the house, so I couldn't enjoy such a nice view as you do today. I'm very glad to see you all here and that so many accepted our invitation here to this dialogue forum hosted under the umbrella of our G7 presidency. Today we want to discuss, as has been mentioned by the moderator, of course, on leveraging private capital for sustainable infrastructure development. Investing in sustainable infrastructure in low and middle income countries is important for many reasons. And basically, it's a backbone of prosperous societies in all parts of the world. First, inclusive infrastructure is pivotal to redressing the painful setbacks in global development progress due to the pandemic. In a nutshell, one can say we were anyway not on track for most of the SDGs, but the pandemic pushed us really back in so many areas. Hunger increases, inequality increased, violence increased, education shrinked, so you name it, and therefore we have to catch up, and infrastructure is key for that. Secondly, high-quality infrastructure can help countries mitigate and adapt to climate change and can thus contribute to reach our COP Paris targets. We started with well below 2 degrees, and nowadays we know how essential it is in most countries of the world also to meet the 1.5 degrees, because the 1.5 and 2 degrees world are substantially different, and a 2 degrees world is definitely not desirable for any one of us. Third, without better infrastructure, it will be impossible to reach the Sustainable Development Targets, as I mentioned before. At least 12 out of the 17 SDGs include indicators that rely on sustainable investments in infrastructure. And last but not least, sustainable infrastructure investments hold great potentials to boost our economies, and by that create high-quality, long-lasting, sustainable jobs, and by that promoting greater social well-being and stability. Investing in sustainable infrastructure is therefore a clear-cut case benefiting both developing countries and the international community as a whole. Unfortunately, there is still a substantial funding gap. The World Bank estimates it to be 15 trillion US dollars. This is roughly the equivalent to the aggregated GDPs of the 27 EU member states. There is also an implementation gap. Often there are not enough bankable and investable projects in the pipeline, or framework conditions are unfavorable to investments from the private sectors. To address all these challenges, the G7, under the leadership of the UK, by the UK, initiated the Partnership for Infrastructure and Investments. Last December, actually, it was day 2 of my new life here in this ministry when we traveled to Liverpool to have the discussion on this very important issues. We are, as we promised already in Liverpool, we will build up on what has been achieved during the last presidency by the UK. This means we are aiming for visible progress this year. We want to achieve progress in developing infrastructure partnerships between the G7 and partner countries in the global south. In the longer term, we are aiming for breakthrough in financing commitments by public and private partners and in the development of bankable project pipelines. As G7, we want to ensure that all investments adhere to the highest prevailing standards in terms of quality, sustainability, and equal access to infrastructure. If you like, this needs to be the quality label of the G7 for such infrastructure investments. One thing is clear, the public sector is key to facilitating infrastructure investments, but it will not be able to bridge the funding gap alone. We need to create a world where we can get much higher leverage rates than we saw it in the past, and I worked on that issue prior to Glasgow with my dear colleague Jonathan Wilkinson from Canada on the 100 billion delivery plan and on climate finance. And the key weakness was, of course, we didn't supply enough budget money, governmental budget, public budget money. But the weakness was that the leverage factor was much lower than we all expected in the past. And as I don't see that budgets in the world will increase, public budgets will increase heavily, we need to work on a better liaison between the public and the private sector. In order to succeed, we need to mobilize, therefore, more private capital and more private expertise. The potential is there. Many private investors are looking for ways to invest their capital long term. I'm happy that several private investors are here with us today. The infrastructure partnership wants investors to bring in their full weight to the table here and elsewhere. Therefore, I'm glad that today they will share you will share your experiences and provide insights as to how governments can create conditions that are more conducive to private investments. To maximize the impact of all investments, public and private, we need to combine our efforts and join forces. Pardon? This is why, I heard the technical instruction, sorry for that. This is why the infrastructure partnership is closely aligned with other initiatives by G7 partners that share the same goals. For example, the US Build Back a Better World or the EU Global Gateway. All of them are selling in to the same direction and supporting the infrastructure partnership of the G7. The infrastructure partnership also aims to build successful country partnerships. It will place our partner countries' needs and development goals at the center. They take account of local conditions and they offer tailor-made support. A good model for such a country partnership is the Just Energy Partnership with South Africa, which was launched last November in Glasgow. I discussed it already with my South African colleague Giocento this morning. Thanks for being here. And I think it was, for me, I told it to you this morning, it was a masterpiece of collaboration. Under the lead of South Africa, the partnership brings together various stakeholders, and the G7 partners together with South Africa were coordinated in the best way I have ever seen. And that made a success, why we could make it in a couple of months to come up with a very meaningful JET-P proposal to Glasgow. And I know many participants, even from the Fridays for Future, who told me that this was the highlight of the COP in Glasgow. And that is why we need to make it happen now. If you want to make it a blueprint, it has to be a success. We are, and I know our G7 partners are absolutely committed to make it a success story together with South Africa. Also, as I said, to make it a blueprint and to create a good example for others. We are working with other partners in the world. We just had Jörg's Indian-German governmental consultations, where the energy transition was also one of the focus areas of discussion. The G7 will initially focus just on this issue, but it should not remain with that. We will extend it to other infrastructures, like, for example, the health infrastructure, where we did a lot already during the past 2 years during the COVID crisis. All country partnerships will be established with a view to also creating an open, inclusive, and collaborative dialogue on climate change. This will be a core priority also to feed in to the envisaged climate club under the G7 presidency. I'm very happy to have our partners here from South Africa. I mentioned you already, from India, Indonesia, and Senegal. I look forward to your insights and ideas on how we can develop these country partnerships into a powerful joint instrument. In order to achieve our goals of developing strong country partnerships and leveraging private capital, we will also draw on the experience and capacities of multilateral development banks, our own G7 national development finance institutions, and the development banks in other partner countries. They are key actors in delivering systematic and lasting solutions to local infrastructure development. This is why the German G7 presidency has reached out to these banks and established an ad hoc MDB's DFI expert group and on infrastructure and investment. The expert group is shared by the World Bank and KfW. Thanks for that, and comprises 18 multilateral, bilateral, and partner country national development banks. It's tasked to advise the G7 on further steps by the infrastructure partnership so as to mobilize capital. Colleagues, it is inspiring to see that despite the multitude of different actors, we all share the same vision of using infrastructure investments as a lever to address the most pressing development challenges and to work towards reaching the SDGs. I'm confident that the same vision will also inspire our discussions this afternoon. And with that, let me thank all of you, and in particular our distinguished panelists later on for your active contribution. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Flassbart, State Secretary here at the Federal Ministry for Economic Development and Cooperation and Development, the BMZ. Thank you. Our next speaker, I warmly welcome Dr. Jörg Kukis to the stage, State Secretary and German G7 Sherpa at the Federal Chancellery. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Jochen, for the kind introduction, and welcome to all of our guests from the G7 countries, from our partner countries, South Africa, Senegal, India, and Indonesia, from the MDBs, from the bilateral finance institutes, from the development financial institutes, from the private sector, and the B7. Many thanks for inviting me for this important event. I have to apologize because we have one president and one head of government from the Western Balkans in town today, so I have to leave the session immediately after my speech. I hope for your understanding on this. We have a very large group of stakeholders here today, which we are very happy about, to discuss how we can be more successful in mobilizing private capital for investment in global sustainable infrastructure. This is an important part of the outreach, which is, of course, an integral component of our G7 presidency, our processes and our priorities. Just on the priorities and our program in the course of the G7 presidency of Germany, the motto that we placed our presidency under is progress towards an equitable world. We have 5 guiding principles within this motto. The first is sustainable planet, where we talk a lot about some of the topics that I've worked on with Jochen over many years in the previous government, and of course now also in the new constellation, namely sustainable planet. We have the idea of joining forces by setting up an inclusive and open climate club, working more on just energy transition partnerships, working on decarbonizing industries. Those are the key priorities on the climate set of priorities that we have. The second priority is economic stability and transformation. As we're all seeing with the macroeconomic problems that we're having in the world, of course, this question of how do we stabilize, how do we manage a positive transformation, giving all of the inflation and challenges to growth, macroeconomic considerations that we have, that is priority number 2. Priority number 3 is health. Healthy lives. That involves a lot of issues surrounding pandemic response and preparedness. Then the key topic of today, investment in a better future, as the 4th priority topic, and that comprises all of the elements around the partnership for infrastructure and investment that Jochen already alluded to. The 5th and final priority that we have, we call Stronger Together, and that incorporates all of the elements and discussion points that we have around the resilience of our democracies, the stability of our democracies against disinformation, and for open open societies and inclusive societies. Of course, we've seen a massive attack on the concept of open societies with the unjustifiable violation of the rules-based international order by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In the G7, we are working very closely. We have a very strong unity within the G7 in our condemnation of the unbelievable violence committed by Russia. And therefore, this is also, of course, a topic that through our presidency has gained massive priority. And one of the elements, of course, is also to think about and to coordinate within the G7 with the MDBs, with the private organizations' support for Ukraine. So that is, of course, a topic that we are touching on very intensively. The Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, as I explained, is part of the fourth pillar of our priorities, investment in a better future. This is an initiative of great importance to the German government. Of course, it cuts across a lot of the other priorities that I talked about, because energy infrastructure, of course, is heavily related to the challenge of achieving climate transformation. It's a key priority for Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the G7 leaders, who in the first statement of the G7 have made it clear how important the continuation of the work of the UK government on their presidency in this topic will be during the course of the year and beyond. The commitment from Carbis Bay in 2021 raised high international expectations on this topic. It's very important that we deliver and that we implement. The key question will be how we integrate all of the elements and components of the various initiatives within the G7, whether it's the US with Build Back Better World, whether it's the Global Gateway of the European Union, the UK initiatives, the Japanese initiatives. The G7 is definitely committed to continuing this work and to rolling out a lot of concrete initiatives. And we're in great agreement both with the previous presidency from the UK and the next presidency from Japan. We had a visit, we were in Tokyo last week, and the Prime Minister Kishida stressed that we will work together also with the incoming presidency in 2023 with Japan on these topics. So a lot of continuation and a lot of long-term commitment is being felt on all of these topics. Of course, what we want is concrete partnerships. We want to make this as specific as we can. Jochen mentioned the example from Glasgow of the joint energy partnership, transition partnership with South Africa. We have the goal of rolling that out to as many of our partner countries as possible. So it's good that many of you are present today so that we can get concrete feedback on what your expectations of this project is and how we can share views and integrate the approaches that you have on this topic, because we do want this to be a true partnership and a true cooperation. Of course, we know that there is quite a lot of structural challenges in this. We're not naive. The question of how to mobilize private capital more effectively and more efficiently is a key component of our thinking. There is a huge investment gap for sustainable infrastructure. So in that sense, it's good that we have also representatives from the development banks, both multilateral and bilateral here, that we can continue work on this with all of the development financial institutions that are present. So it's also good that there's participants from the private sector here. We very explicitly want to crowd in private capital. We want to define joint projects. We want to understand what the expectations of the private sector are, what we can do to get as many of you to participate in these in this initiative as we can. And as I said, the key issue is to crowd in as many private sector participants as we can into this initiative. One of the many examples, in addition to the South African partnership, is the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund, which is a blended public-private finance fund supported by governments, by DFIs, but also, of course, of private investors, with the goal of investing in green infrastructure assets in emerging economies. So those are specific examples of where we are headed. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you on the kinds of approaches that you are looking to participate in, what your recommendations are to us as the representatives from governments, what the requirements are to get this to a higher and more concrete level. But of course, also we're interested in hearing from you what you would like to participate and bring to the table, because it is, of course, a partnership that will only succeed if we all cooperate. So to conclude, PAI is very high on our agenda. Leaders are very interested in this, in getting concrete results out of this. Infrastructure is very much top of mind, whether it's energy, whether it's transport, whether it's education, whether it's health. It completely cuts across all of the priorities that we have. We are very interested in hearing the results of your work, all of the experts groups that are working into this, and all of the work that also is feeding into this initiative will be an important input into all of the preparation that we're going into for the summit in wonderful Elmau in Bavaria, which is less than 2 months away. So many thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to all of your input, and I wish you a very successful conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jörg Kukis. And of course, only almost 8 weeks away, Elmau is a little bit of a pressure date. Thank you for reminding us. Thank you for joining us, to you both. Thank you. And now our next speaker will frame, of course, again, the challenges ahead for the G7 infrastructure partnership, and we'll put it more into perspective. Why is infrastructure so important for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how big is the investment gap that we just listened to, and what causes this gap? These are just a few questions that are now outlined by Professor Ulrich Volz from the German Development Institute and the SOAS University of London. Well, welcome to you. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Katie. Great pleasure to have the opportunity to address you all. Just don't you wonder, I'll be looking at this screen because they're my slides, and I need my slides to know what I should talk about. So I was indeed asked by the organizer to frame this challenge and to say a bit about why it is so important that we advance the infrastructure agenda to also progress with the SDGs. I'll talk a bit about the financing gap and what's hindering investment, but I will also want to add some thoughts on what I think could and should be done to address these issues. So first on the importance of infrastructure for the SDGs. So as you all know, and that's the reason why I'm here, infrastructure is absolutely critical for sustainable development. Infrastructure plays a key role in achieving or progressing on all 3 dimensions of sustainability: the economy, the environment, and society. From transport systems to power generation facilities and water and sanitation networks, infrastructure provides really the services that are crucial for our economies to thrive and to progress. And so enhancing and upgrading infrastructure has to be at the very heart of our efforts to progress with the SDG agenda. And it's very important to highlight that future-proofing infrastructure is absolutely critical also for boosting resilience and adaptation of our economies and societies. And it's also important to emphasize that infrastructure is both impacted by climate and environmental change, but also is having an impact on the environment, and there are lots of different feedback loops. So infrastructure really must be resilient. We have to retrofit existing infrastructure to make it resilient. And of course, we also need to future-proof new infrastructure. And I think in this context, it's important to emphasize that traditional great infrastructure development will just not be good enough to provide the climate resilience and the level of services that is needed in this world we're living in today. So putting nature at work by integrating green approaches in traditionally grey infrastructure development can really help to improve outcomes and support also communities and the environment. Very briefly on the financing gap. So we've already heard about this challenge, and you're all familiar with the UN estimates of the financing gap of $2.5 trillion. Infrastructure accounts for more than 40% of this gap. The World Bank and World Resources Institute estimate that the investment needs of developing and emerging economies to invest infrastructure is 4.5% of GDP, so it's enormously large. And a big problem is, of course, that over the last 2 years with the pandemic, the financing gap has been widening. We've seen, on the one hand, an increase in spending needs of governments around the world, and many developing countries have been constrained in that due to their fiscal conditions. But we've also seen a fall in investment, including private investment in many countries. And the OECD has framed this as the scissor effect. So investment needs are increasing, but available resources are going the other direction. So there is really an urgent need to intensify efforts to boost infrastructure financing. But one thing that's extremely worrying is that we are now facing a looming debt crisis in the global south. So there are a lot of developing and emerging countries that are really struggling to stay afloat. And of course, they're themselves facing great troubles in funding much needed infrastructure. But there is also a problem insofar as it's going to be very difficult to attract private capital into countries that are struggling and possibly facing sovereign debt crisis. According to the World Bank, developing country debt has risen sharply to a 50-year high. And World Bank estimates suggest that debt account for around 250% of government revenues. So it's really a big challenge. The World Bank and IMF estimate that around 60% of low-income countries are already experiencing or at high risk of debt distress. And this is a very big challenge when we talk about raising capital when many of the countries are really struggling to survive. I'll get back to that point later on. Now, on the question, what hinders investment? Of course, all of you have thought a lot about this, and there are a lot of problems, both with kind of investment, framework conditions. So I'm not going to go into all these things. There are so many bottlenecks in the real economy and the financial markets that hold back infrastructure investment. Insufficient investment frameworks, currency transfer risk, political risk. There are a lot of serious challenges investors are facing. So getting the investment framework conditions right is critical, and it's very easily said, but very difficult to do. Of course, we need to work on developing the pipeline of investable projects. So the capital as such is not the problem, but the pipeline of investable projects, that's the problem. And one problem I want to highlight in particular is the cost of capital problem. Here you have a chart showing the average interest cost of outstanding government debt in percent of different developing country groups and also advanced countries. I hope you can read that, or you can see that. And so advanced countries, of course, have been benefiting from extremely low real interest rates, which have facilitated investment, but developing emerging countries have a much higher cost of capital, and that has been holding back both private and public investment. And even worse, climate change and physical impacts of climate change are making life much more difficult. So we've been doing a couple of empirical studies where we were able to show that climate vulnerability already now is driving up the cost of capital of climate vulnerable developing countries. So they have to pay a climate risk premium. And that is, again, a big barrier to ramping up investment, because those countries that most urgently need to invest in resilience, in all kinds of infrastructure, face high cost of capital. So they are underinvesting with climate change advancing, the vulnerabilities increase further. Of course, also capital markets are increasingly acknowledging these risks and pricing these risks ever more. So many countries are facing some kind of vicious circle, and we need to really boost climate resilient investment to turn this around into a vicious into a virtuous circle, where more investment in resilient infrastructure can boost overall resilience and really help to bring down the cost of capital. And of course, that's also an area where you have to play a critical role. And that brings me to the question, what to do? Now, I was asked to be a little bit provocative, so I thought I'd throw in a quote from Charles Kenny from the Center for Global Development, who just recently wrote, the idea that you can use a little bit of public money to bring to life a vast array of private investment projects in infrastructure and services isn't just fiction, it's utter fantasy. And I think we have to have a sober look at what the billions to trillions agenda has really delivered to date. And we haven't really reached the trillions, and we need to reach the trillions. And the question is, to what degree can we really address the problems to make it work? Now, I'm actually myself on the advisory committee of GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and I'm very much hoping that the private, or that there will be a greater success in channeling private capital into developing countries to finance all the needs. But I think we have to be realistic, and we really have to, I think, bring our expectations on what the kind of project-based mobilization, de-risking approach can really deliver. And there's no question that we need absolutely to leverage private finance for development in infrastructure. But I think we need to think how we can best do that. And here we have, I would say, a tried and tested approach that has been working quite well for the last 70 years. Not perfect, but fairly well. And that is using multilateral development banks to leverage private capital. And so if we take 5 of the largest MDBs, they, in 2018, had a combined paid-in capital from their shareholders of $43 billion, and they used this to support on a loan portfolio of 374 billion. So that's a 1-to-9 ratio, which is not too bad. And I think there is much more that could be done through multilateral development banks. And I would certainly argue that for the time being, the potential of multilateral development banks is underused. There has been discussion on optimizing the balance sheet. Chris Humphrey from ODI in 2020 suggested that callable capital from the best-rated shareholders could be included in capital adequacy calculations. Also, statutory lending limits could be changed, and that this could raise an additional $750 billion. Now, I know this is very controversial, and, but I think these are things we need to discuss. I also think there's an urgent need to discuss capital increases. Again, it's not that all G7 countries are waiting to do that, but I think we need to have this discussion. Last year, there was a big windfall gain with the allocation of 650 billion of SDRs. Unfortunately, only a fraction of this has gone or has been committed by advanced countries to rechanneling through MDBs or the IMF, which is now setting up the RST. And I think this would be a crucial issue that all G7 countries should do. They should commit to using their SDRs from this allocation, those that haven't been committed already, to put into MDBs. And there's one important further way how MDBs can leverage private capital, and that is they can also raise capital in the markets they're operating in local currency. And I think that's a very important issue. So there is not a single country in the world that has developed based on exclusively external finance. Domestic resource mobilization is absolutely critical. And one big problem is that for the time being, actually a lot of savings from developing countries are channeled into savings, into safe assets in advanced countries. Because the safe assets often are missing at home. And MDBs, also DFIs, can issue a domestic currency bond, collect capital, provide the opportunity of local investors to really invest in safe assets, and this can be a big boost to investment. State Secretary Flassbart mentioned the great importance of national development banks. I would absolutely like to second that. They can play a very important role, often they do, in stemming investments in the just transition. Again, we should be having discussions about increasing not the cost, but the capital of national development banks. Also importantly, update their mission so that they're really focused on the key investments that are needed. And I think also we should be having more of a discussion about creating new national development banks with a very clear mandate. And here again, we can use different ways. Of course, capitalization can happen through MDBs, DFIs, also global funds, and indeed also private investors. So that is, I think, also a very important way of bringing in private capital to advance the agenda. A further issue I think that needs to get much more attention is harnessing the potential of digital finance for scaling up sustainable investment. There are a lot of opportunities to use fintech, blockchain approaches to create greater transparency around infrastructure developments, attract private investment, and importantly also small-scale retail investment. Recently, I had a piece on such approaches out in the Development Finance Review, and there are actually some great examples out there. So in Kenya, the government had launched the Akiba project, through which it raised capital from small-scale retail investors through mobile phones. So based on all the developments in the mobile phone banking area, and we need to leverage on these examples. I'm coming to an end, but I also want to emphasize the importance of aggregation. We have a lot of the investments need to take place in, for example, smaller cities, and municipalities often can't really access capital markets. And there's a great role for aggregation. And the most important aggregators are, of course, banks. But we should also discussing about creating special purpose aggregators for key sectors, and especially infrastructure, through which then also smaller entities can access capital. And there are some good examples, for example, municipal finance agencies in the US, in different EU countries, that help municipalities to tap the big capital. And then my final point, I already mentioned earlier on that a lot of countries are struggling severely with debt crisis. And if we don't address this, we can pretty much forget about the SDGs, achieving the SDGs, and really scaling up investment, because countries that are struggling to repay their debts won't really have any fiscal space to invest in infrastructure or anything else that you want to see investment in for development. And the current frameworks from the G20 with the common framework for debt restructuring, they haven't really delivered. And we need to have more innovative approaches, more systemic approaches to really address this looming debt crisis. BMZ also has been, of course, looking into this. And I think this is an agenda that also the G7 need to advance. Of course, there's also an important dialogue to be had with China, which is the largest bilateral creditor. But we have to tackle the debt crisis as well. So with this, let me conclude. All of this, of course, needs to be embedded in a broader sustainable finance agenda. So we need to mainstream sustainable finance. We need to make sure that all lending and investment decisions account for climate and other environmental and social risks and impacts. So that also has to be part of this, and that's also something where central banks and supervisors need to play an important role. But I'm not going to go into this now. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ulrich Volz. Thanks for joining us today. And now we are heading into our first panel discussion, ladies and gentlemen. We talk about the private investment, of course, in the private sector view. What are the success stories? What are the obstacles to investment? And what is the need for action? I'd like to welcome now on stage Matthias Grämer from the Bundesverband der Deutschen Industrie. He's the head of department, External Economic Policy in the Business 7 chapter. Welcome to you. Here next to me, please. And we do have Martin Ewald with us. He's a Managing Director in the London office of Allianz Global Investors. A warm welcome goes also out to you. Thank you. Darshan Viganaraja. I'm still... Thumbs up. Yeah, he's the director of the UK and the EU Climate Policy Initiative, recently joined. Thank you very much to CPI, and also thanks for joining us today. A warm welcome goes out to you. And digitally, we are joined by Christian Desiglis. He's the Group Head Sustainable Infrastructure from the HSBC. I hope we can see you in a minute. All right, let's start. I just wanted to have a quick look into our technical department if Monsieur Desiglis is joining us.
I'm here, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Wonderful.
Can you hear me?
Now I can see you and I can hear you.
And
Wonderful.
okay.
It's early morning in the US, I assume.
Oh,
So
it's fine. It's 9 a.m. I've been up for a couple of hours already. Thank you very much.
thank you for joining us today. Okay, so then the round is completed. Mr. Kremer, I'd like to start with you as you are, as I mentioned and introduced you, the B7 Sherpa. You are representing, of course, the industry interest vis-à-vis to the G7, and you lead the working groups on the G7 issues. When you were listening to the gap concerning the private investment in public infrastructure, where do you see the problem? Why is private investment in public infrastructure declining? And maybe you can combine that with your expectations from your work experience towards the G7.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think on behalf of the B7 process, we look on all these questions and all these issues more or less from a global view. I mean, when we have decided at the BDI, together with our B7 partner confederations, to implement a working group on all these issues and all these questions, we did not only want to support the German government in its fourth pillar that State Secretary Cookies mentioned, we also wanted to provide more transparency and information within our membership, within our community. Because if I may say like this, apart from a community like this, if we talk about initiatives like Global Gateway, the initiatives that Jörg Cookies mentioned in Japan, Great Britain, Build Back Better World, and so on, it's not so pretty known, and it's not so the case that everybody looks onto it and has a concrete idea. So we see our role in the B7 process, and not to, I would say, produce concrete investment business cases or in order to give real instruments. We would like to give further information. We would like to make it more public, and because we see the strong need. And we heard both state secretaries that mentioned the gap in the funding, so maybe we can contribute a little bit with our activities, but this is really the impression that we all had from our B7 colleagues as well, that there is still a road to go in order to, maybe I can put it like this. It was Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. He once said, "Let's follow the money." And it's pretty hard to follow the money when you don't know where the money is. So we have to connect the public borrowers with the private sector. And there maybe we can contribute a little bit.
Let's follow the money. I just want to pick on that. But do we also know the direction, the correct direction? Or is that also an open question from your side?
I think when we talk about standards, when we talk about the sustainability goals, and so we all go into the same directions. And we also look on initiatives like Global Gateway Initiative, of course, in a bigger context. And of course, we see it as another tool maybe in order to spread our values, in order to spread our standards, and in order to give a race to the top and not to the race to the bottom if we look at standards on sustainability and other classifications. So I think the direction is clear, even for the B7 community so far.
And my second question was a little bit going into the direction, what is the expectation from your side towards the G7? What do you see as a homework, so to say?
Well, I think we both talked before. For example, Martin Ewald mentioned a very interesting project. Maybe he will come back later to this, and it is constructed, if I may so, under the standards of the EIB. And how bring we together those standards maybe with standards coming from the Build Back Better world, coming from the United States? So how can we bring all these initiatives more together? How can we create a common space in order to fill in the gap of funding? So this might be one of the recommendations that we finally will give by the end of May. We are still working on it in our working group, and I really have to say we have 5 different working groups: climate policy issue, digitization, and so on. And in this working group, it's the hardest job. It is really the hardest job for us to find out and to make it concrete what we on behalf on B7 would like to recommend to the governments. So more to come, I hope.
Thank you, Matthias Krieme. Thank you for joining us and for your insights. Martin Ewald, are there any points where you would disagree or where you would go along when we talk about it is difficult to make it very concrete? Is it as difficult as we just listened to and heard?
It is difficult. I think that's for sure. And I think also when we listen to Professor Volz, we see why it is so difficult, how complicated it is. And thanks for Mr. Kremer to mention that. We just heard also from Staatssekretär Kukis. The product is like the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund, which we run and operate, structured together with KfW, of course, on behalf of BMU, and we operate it together with the European Investment Bank. And what do? We work on equity, because this is one of the points where I would want to add to Professor Volz. Equity is needed on the ground, especially patient long-term capital. And we have a concentration around mitigation, as in renewable energy in emerging economies, but also adaptation. And in the absence of enough equity on the ground, of course, there is like really hard to build up the pyramid. And so therefore we see ourselves in someone providing bottom-up solutions. So therefore also if we think about the obstacles and we operate, as you said, like MCAF together with the European Investment Bank, we see that as us providing bottom-up support, as in like providing the equity, financing the local developers or the local funds so they can set up the projects. They will be larger funds, and then in turn also that then should channel the way for more commercial capital also flowing into emerging economies. We run the same principle with Africa Grow together with KfW and DEG, and essentially what we do is we build solutions. So in the search for how can we really channel capital on the ground, this is where we see our mission as an asset manager to not just say there must be more, but how can it be mobilized and on which standards. And this is where environmental and social governance comes into place. And we also had like a bit of a pre-discussion around how investments should be done in the proper way. KfW standards are at the highest there are. And when we operate the funds, and Africa Grow and the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund run in my team, so it's a private investor investing, we operate together with KfW, we operate together with the EIB in order to only implement under the highest ENS standards, environmental and social. And I think this is our perception of what we can do in order to also pave the way for further commercial equity flowing in. And therefore also best practice for us is really, we want to lead by example, by really showing how it is possible, what works. And with Africa Grow, we are already active since 2019. We've already carried out 7 transactions. And with the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund, we are now closing our first transactions. And if we were to be allowed to have something on our wish list for G7, I think Staatssekretär Kukis already said so, like really getting an understanding like how important of a tool those blended equity structures essentially can be, because we can mobilize, and that's what Staatssekretär Flassbart said, the mobilization of equity on the ground in our case is up to 50. So every euro which is invested by public money into blended equity can mobilize up to 50 euros on the ground in projects, like if you see the total capex together. And that is then providing for that leverage and hopefully also helping to solve parts of the problem we already learned earlier.
This little wish is noted also, of course, for further debate. Brings me to the point, if you have questions, of course, please let me know. Give me a hand sign, or ladies and gentlemen, in the internet, in the live stream, also share your thoughts and your questions with us. That's why we have the box, so please submit your questions in our virtual space. Darshan, thank you also, of course, for coming to our panel today. The Climate Policy Initiative is more of a think tank than an investor in its own, if I understood it correctly. And you also work a lot on instruments, and you also work on ideas to facilitate, when we talk about facilitation from private capital and this private capital mobilization. So can you give us, from your perspective, and of course from your experience also with the COP26 background, a list of priorities that you see when we talk about private capital mobilization?
I can attempt to do so. So let me just start by first picking up on Matea's point about following the money. So I think it's absolutely crucial to set and understand the baseline as well as you can. So CPI do a lot of work in the space of identifying climate finance flows. I think most people will be familiar with one of their flagship products, which is the Global Landscape for Climate Finance. I think 2019-20 showed there's 630 billion in climate finance flowing currently. I think the estimates suggest that it needs something like a 6-fold increase between now and 2030 in order to get us onto some of those low carbon trajectories that the state secretaries referred to. So I think that piece of the jigsaw, really understanding the flows from whom, to whom, across which sectors, from which categories of private finance investors are exceedingly important. And that can help inform how do you tackle the barriers, how do you overcome some of the obstacles. I think some of what Martin said also relates very specifically to specific types of investment products. On the equity side, you will see different solutions than you might see on the debt side. For an infrastructure sector like energy, the solution in decentralized energy access is very different from a large-scale hydropower. And the financing required for both are quite distinct and different. So I think one of the critical things to get right here is to make sure that as a collective group, we force ourselves to use the right language. When we talk about private finance...
Sorry, put your microphone a little bit closer, yes.
Excellent, sorry, it just keeps... when you talk about private finance, I think we need to be very specific about the categories we mean. Are we talking about asset owners, asset managers, investment banks? Which part of the investment bank is looking in and assessing that deal? We also need to understand, and Professor Volz referred to it, where is that capital flowing from? It is hugely important to unlock domestic capital flows, as well as, and it's easy to focus on the international flow, but ultimately international capital is highly unlikely to invest in a situation where they don't see, or it's not clear to them that domestic investors are willing to take the risk, under the basis that you would make cogent argument that the domestic investor better understands and is closer to the set of risks that they're facing. So I would highlight those as related issues. In terms of best practices to overcome, let me give you 3 thoughts. Why is the private sector very good at being part of the solution? 3 things: their depth, their ability to develop, and diversity and renewal. Let me talk about each of them very quickly. In depth, the private sector is incentivized to get much closer because their, if you like, bottom line, increasingly triple bottom line, depends on it. So they are incentivized internally. I'm sure Martin and Matthias may have perspectives on this, but they're incentivized to make sure they get it right? They have a deep understanding of the market they're attempting to get involved in. And I think there's enough evidence that those who are nimble and patient are able to make returns, We've seen that across the last 5, 10, even longer timescales. We also know that infrastructure debt default rates in emerging markets are on par with some of the rates that we're seeing in the OECD. So I think there's lots of opportunities revealed by the depth at which private sector investors play. Then to the point of the pipeline. Of course, the pipeline is critical. and the enabling environment around which that pipeline operates is important. CPI, as you mentioned, does a lot of work in the lab where we support early stage and develop public-private concepts that look like they have the ability to scale. But crucial to that is the role of project developers. And in that space, it is a #1 priority that the G7 and others give ample and sufficient support into project developers in emerging market and developing economies. There are some outstanding examples of those who do it well, and they do it well because they have the right capacity and the right capabilities. So that would be my second thought. And then in terms of diversity, I would say the private sector they're quicker on their feet, right? The speed to action, the decision making is much faster. Having spent 16 years in the private sector and 7 years in the public sector, I have a sense of how that works. And that is a tremendous advantage to MDBs and DFIs looking to leverage that know-how and knowledge. Let me leave it there.
Thank you for this first takeoff. And I come back to you in a second. If you could just remember your thought, I just want to bring in Christian into our first round. Christian, HSBC is, of course, big money, but I understand you also, of course, work, what we mentioned throughout the day, on public-private partnerships for sustainable infrastructure. And I think we're all curious to hear more about that, about your priorities and your focus that you see as the most important in your look into how to mobilize private capital.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry that I'm not able to join in person, but I think it's probably good for the climate footprint of my participation. Look, it's difficult also to, sorry, it's difficult to, I'm sorry, it's early morning and I'm a little, my throat is a little, okay. So yeah, it's difficult. There has been so many good things which have been said this morning that it's going to be a little bit difficult for me to add, especially to the great presentation that Professor Ulrich Vols made. Look, I think all the issues that he's been raising are the right ones. Infrastructure is absolutely critical from a development point of view, but unfortunately, infrastructure has been carbon heavy and continues to be carbon heavy. It's about 70% of emissions, of global GHG emissions today, are coming from the building, maintenance, and operation of infrastructure assets across the world, and approximately 70% of that is coming from emerging markets. Where the need for continued building of infrastructure assets will remain really high. I think what he mentions also that the magnitude of the challenge and the issues that have been compounded by the pandemic in terms of the financing ability are absolutely critical ones. So I think we absolutely agree on the statement. I think from a private sector point of view, I believe we face really 4 significant issues. One, which was mentioned before, is the lack of bankable projects. I think, especially in emerging markets, there are not enough bankable projects. The second one is that a lot of the projects remain carbon heavy, which is compromising the future progress towards net zero and continues to contribute to climate change. The third one is that I think institutional investors are keen to be crowded in. They are interested in the long-term and stable returns that infra assets can bring. But today there is no way for them, and for most institutional investors, to actually verify which assets are genuinely and certifiably sustainable. Which brings me to the question of standards, which was raised a couple of times. We did at HSBC, we did a survey a year ago, and we asked 1,000 investors across the world whether they were investing in infrastructure assets and whether they had interest in investing in infra assets. And 25% of investors say they do invest in infra, and another 50% say they want to invest and they want to invest more in infra. So there is real interest, real appetite, but when we ask them whether they are confident that their assets are certifiably and are genuinely sustainable, 80% of them say they are not. So I think this is a really significant issue. And I'll come to some of the solutions in a second. And the fourth, I think, issue, which was mentioned a couple of times here, is the one around scalability. There are many solutions which have been brought to the market, which have been invented in the last few years, but those are, I mean, very few of them are really scalable. Lots of great pilots, $100 million, $500 million, sometimes $1 billion. But very few are really scalable. The good news is that now I think there are some things which are happening which make me confident that we are getting closer to solutions. One, around standards. We have, together with CPI, together with the OECD, together with the Global Infra Facility, with many multilateral development banks, many institutional investors, we've launched in Glasgow the Fast Infra Sustainable Infra Standard, the Fast Infra label. This is, to my knowledge, one of the first label which has been developed mapping pretty much all the frameworks defining sustainable infrastructure that exists, whether it is the EU taxonomy, whether it is the QIIP, whether it is the IFC performance standards. We've looked at more than 25 frameworks and definitions and standards for sustainable infrastructure. We've distilled them into 14 criteria under 4 dimensions of E, S, G, and climate resiliency and climate adaptation. And we are now on the verge of establishing a secretariat, an infrastructure, data repository, and so on and so forth to really create, I think, the first label defining sustainable infra, which I think will attract institutional investors and will also contribute to embedding higher sustainability standards into the development of infra assets across the world, not only in the developed world, but also in emerging countries. So we launched that at Glasgow with endorsement from GFANZ, from the Sustainable Markets Initiative, ICLE, and many others. So I'm very confident that this will be one of the tools that will make infrastructure an asset class. The second thing I would like to mention, and I'll go quickly, is the role of MDBs. I think that's absolutely critical. They have a huge role to play, not only in bringing capital, but also in bringing knowledge. I think they are a critical actor that are credible with the public and private sector. We launched 6 months ago at HSBC a joint venture with Temasek to provide funding, to provide financing to marginally bankable projects in Southeast Asia, infrastructure assets, trying to address this issue around bankability. It's a joint venture between a large sovereign wealth fund and a bank, but also with the technical assistance, project preparation, capacity building of the Asian Development Bank. The ADB is joining us as a partner in that. So I think that's one example that merits attention because it's really bringing together the various partners and providing something which can be scalable. And the last thing I would say is country platforms. I think that's really important to provide a holistic view. The South Africa example was great. All the work of GFANZ and CFLI around country platform pilot for India, Indonesia, I think are providing some really interesting solutions.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you for your points. Martin, you were nodding, of course, to a few answers. Can you share with us where you agree and maybe where you disagree or where you have a different perspective when we talk about different points, the in-depth, the diversity to revenue, all the points that were just mentioned?
Yep. Being polite, of course, start with agreement. So I think especially what you said about the project developers, that is also key for us. And also I think it nicely tunes into what Professor Volz said with regards to like, how can we scale up? And single project scale up is just very difficult. KfW has been in the field, like, and also DG for a while. It just takes a lot of time, which is why we think really also larger platform approaches, and I also think CFLI, the country initiatives, we're also participating in CFLI. I think that's a good approach to really try to also scale up. In our case, we do that by running fund of funds rather than just single investments. Not that we don't believe in that, but we think it's like easier to replicate and scale up. Where I think where we could wish for is also with regards to availability of concessional capital. So that's a right in our area. This is the rarest good. And if that was easier available, I mean, like we're also private investors. We have a great partnership with KfW and now with EIB. So we're able to attract it, but it is not possible for a private investor to attract concessional capital. And therefore, also the timing advantage, which Darshan also spoke about, we potentially might have, that's then not happening. So therefore also the speed of execution is key. And also what we do see is like then also that some of the concessional capital programs are really tightened to then again single countries in order to make them more maybe crisp or understandable. But if you're institutional capital as we are, and we represent in MCAF 350 million euro regulated, solvency regulated insurance capital from Europe, you need to diversify. And if you're just in a single country risk or single country fund, then it's getting complicated. And this is then again like our role to balance the view of the public investors and our private investors. And private investors about diversification, about broader spreading of risks, about upside and downside sharing in structures. And that again, like this is where we see our role also in the dialogue with our partners.
Matthias, you wanted to add on something, as you mentioned.
Maybe please allow that I bring in quite another point. I mean, because if I listen to you, and this is very interesting and parts of it very technically, but I was wondering about the question, how can we deal in Europe, or how have we to deal in Europe, and hopefully very soon, with a peaceful situation in the Ukraine. And I think we have to provide amounts of money we all can't imagine in order to build up this country again. Won't there be any impact on that? I mean, because in every other political discussions that we lead, for example, we are looking up on the ministerial conference of the WTO. Just one example. There won't be a solution because there will be the Russians on the table, so forget about it. And I mean, isn't that maybe making this funding gap that both Secretary of States mentioned, making even bigger on behalf of Europe spoken, I guess?
Yes, Martin.
Yeah,
and then
so
Darshan.
if I may, so certainly scarcity of assets will also make concessional capital scarcer. I think that's very obvious. The beauty though is, and I mean like as we speak right now in India, it's like the highest temperatures ever measured. Like we have flooding in Spain. So as we speak right now, we know climate change is happening. As we speak right now, we know we need to decarbonize. And we also need to allow emerging economies to leapfrog, not getting first into fossil fuel and then in renewables. They need to leapfrog right away. And that is where the amounts are needed. And the beauty of what we're doing is we have €1 of public capital, and then we add €2 of private capital in the case. So in other words, like if the public capital on its own would invest, they could invest for, in our case, for 200 million. Together with us, it would be 600 million. So the private sector is able to come up with another 400 million under those models we propose. And therefore, we hope that what we are doing there will then be able to combine those two dimensions.
Darshan, what is your recipe when we face all these disruptive times right now that we are facing with the conflicts and, of course, the crises? We're just getting out of a pandemic crisis. What is your take on that when you listen, of course, also to when you were pointing out to the early steps and the early stages? What's crucial when we talk about project development? Of course, enabling and motivating entrepreneurship in that regard and private capital mobilization.
Yes. I mean, I think if anyone had a recipe now, it's a good time to volunteer it. I don't know that we have the solutions when you said it. You know, there is a simplicity, a beautiful simplicity in sitting in a think tank because you can you can opine, right? You're not a practitioner in a similar way to either a private investor or a government representative. But a couple of reflections. One is, Matthias is right? There's a limit to concessional finance. I think we continually need to reappraise and think through carefully how are we using it, how are we deploying it. Professor Volter's thoughts around the MDBs, certainly my background in the British government is you assess across all of the different channels through which you're using concessional capital, which ones do mobilize the most. That doesn't always mean that then you should channel all your money through that route, but at least it gives you some indications of what works and what doesn't. And certainly the MDBs, the DFIs, where they are most engaged with leveraging private capital, some of what Martin has talked about, actually even some of what Christian is talking about, they connect very closely with the opportunities that are being driven by the MDBs and the IFIs. So we do need to keep thinking about that. But I want to raise, the Christian from an HSBC perspective and Martin from a Allianz perspective, they're also driven by the fact that there's a real opportunity here, right? So you don't go through 25 frameworks and put together a sense of 4 dimensions unless you feel like there is a clear product. And that, I think, relates back to the private sector has the ability to innovate and kind of come up with solutions, right? I think in this type of discussion, it's quite dangerous to dwell on the role of concessional capital. I mean, I think we've watched over 20 years how concessional capital, you can wait for it, you hope there'll be some first loss, you hope it'll be, but a lot of the things that we see in the market, MCPP, ILX, a number of the initiatives have taken a long period to incubate, require a great deal of thought, and aren't at the scale that we want. So my challenge to everyone in the room would be, well, now is the time to think with the energy transition disruption that we're seeing, how can we, vault across a couple of these hurdles? I don't think it's an absence of ideas. I think you can have a discussion around political leadership, but I think there is a question around, how willing are you to put the resources against some of these issues at the scale that we'd like to see? And I think the Just Energy Transition program in South Africa, though the devil is in the detail and will require quite a lot of, careful graft to get the financing structure right and make sure that both the public and the private elements can come together, you can tell in rooms like this that it inspires people, right? And not just in these rooms, but it goes beyond. And what you need is to couple that inspiration with some genuine progress, ideally between COP26 and COP27, and then couple it to country platforms, GFANs, are those participants beginning to be able to make some investment allocations that is different.
A quick add-on, yes, before we start with your questions, ladies and gentlemen. So please raise your hands and give me a sign if you have any questions.
Try to keep it short, because essentially what you're saying is like concession capital won't be there forever. So we need to catalyze, we need to change. And this is what we are doing. Like, we are a private investor, so therefore also we invest like a private investor. So we need to take care of taxes and topics like that. And I just came back from Senegal, from the AFCA conference in Dakar, which was amazing. And we, like in Africa Grow, which we run together with BMZ, we already do that. And we can see there is additional private capital flowing in after we came in there. So this catalytical, transformational, crowding in sort of element, this is what we need to be going, because otherwise, I totally agree, concessional capital can't be it on its own.
Thank you for this add-on. Do we have any questions from the room to our panelists, or do we have questions from the internet, from our audience online? Not right now, but I'm sure we're going to have. Yes, one question, wonderful. 2 questions, lovely. It's always a quick start. We start, wonderful, thank you so much for the start. We have a microphone. Our colleague will guide you through. She will hold the microphone because we're still living in these pandemic times. So please don't feel uncomfortable and tell us your question. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm Rachel Turner from the UK. I wanted to ask you a question about sovereign financing. So you've been talking a lot about mobilizing private finance, and I guess there's kind of an assumption underlying there. It's private into private, private for commercial infrastructure. But equally, we know coming out of COP, and the State Secretary said there are also these huge state-led needs for infrastructure. And I think in the G7 we have a high ambition also to see if we can in any way kickstart the green bond sovereign market, and potentially at a price that allows countries to raise their sovereign financing below their standard bond issuances. And maybe that's an unrealistic ambition, but I wondered if the panel had any advice for us on that private to sovereign piece, and if there are any recommendations for the G7 to help make that work. Thanks.
Christian, I would love to start with you. If you have any advice, please let us know.
Yeah, sure. Look, it's a good question. Most of the infrastructure projects will have a public dimension to them, so they will be, in many instances, public-private partnership, where the state, the government, or the local, the region will play a critical role, or where the utility that will be the off-taker, for instance, for a power project or for a water project will be somehow state-owned or linked to the public sector. So I think in most cases there is a public dimension to it. Few projects are purely private, and this is a constant issue, and that's one of the issues also with difficulty in mobilizing finance for infrastructure projects in emerging markets, because of the wide variety of stakeholders which are involved in the development and the structuring of the project. But yeah, it's a critical dimension. Thank you.
Darshan, do you have any points to add on to our question?
I can add a couple. I used to work with Rachel, so it's a wonderful experience to be on this side. The only things I'd add is, look, number one, I think the G7 can lead through example. I think the UK were relatively late in issuing their first green gilt. So I think all G7 should look and assess the viability and when's appropriate to go to the market, because I think that sends signals. I think that can influence other members, and there's not a lot of common ground at the moment in the fora of the G20, but by demonstrating and taking action, that's one way to provide some direction. I think CPI in London has the privilege of sharing an office with the Climate Bonds Initiative, led by Sean Kidney. So when I talk to Sean about this topic, he is absolutely crystal clear that where possible, we should be supporting emerging markets with their own sovereign bond issuances. We should be channeling, be it ODA support or technical assistance to build the capabilities, the type of work that I think the UK is doing and some others are. And then the last thing I would say is on quality and standardization, you can track the progress of the green bond market. It is almost exponential, but it's still a fraction of the overall corporate debt issuance space. So I think, it's very important that the validity and the verification processes work well. And I think G7 members have a role in supporting institutions like the Climate Bond Initiative to help play a role in getting the standardization, the recognition across the products, so that it's easier for investors to have confidence that when they're buying into that product, this is a genuine set of assets that are going to reap the benefits that they hope to see. Thanks.
Thank you. One more question here from our live audience. I think you raised up your hands. The same topic. Oh, what a coincidence. Well, then we have two questions here. We start here in the first row, coming back to the fourth row, and then we do have someone joining us virtually from the internet. No, here, here, first row.
Okay. Yeah, Jürgen Sattler here from the ministry, and one specific question, because many of you said it's really a tough order to mobilize private finance at scale. There are many obstacles you have to overcome. In your point of view, does it make sense to focus on specific areas where perhaps the order is a little bit less tough? So, for example, to focus on countries where you already see certain favorable preconditions and sectors where perhaps it's a little bit easier to mobilize finance. So, for example, focus on one sector in one country and try to make it happen with a concerted effort by turning on all these screws which are important in the context. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, would you point out your comment to that?
I think, like, from our perspective, it's easier if you have a mix of countries. So we see that with Africa Grow, where we have a Pan-African approach, and then some of the funds we invest into are single country funds, but we prefer also them to be mixed. So that's private equity and venture capital. And for the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund, it's also something where we see that that's a fund in renewable energy mostly, that if you're just in a single country, then you're exposed, like the single country currency, legislation, and then you would have like a strike on your whole portfolio. So therefore, we as institutional investors then prefer like a broader scheme, which is like coming back to what I tried to express earlier, is making it also difficult then to mobilize concessional capital, which is just bound to one specific industry in one specific country. So we advance quite a lot in structuring vehicles, so we are able to carve out certain elements, but ultimately, from an institutional investor point of view, better to be spread over several categories, funds, and countries and currencies.
Thank you, Martin. Coming to our next question here, wonderful, the lady, and then the gentleman just next to her, and then afterwards we go live.
Hi, I'm Lyda Fitz from the U.S. Treasury, and I really appreciated a great panel. A member of you mentioned standards, and I thought it was interesting, certainly the fast infra sort of points at one of the tensions with standards is, the tension with the speed and the cost that ESG particular standards, have on projects. And I'm curious how you as investors see that balance. How do you balance that in your own portfolios, particularly in emerging markets where the cost sensitivity is particularly great? So, those high standards versus the speed and cost to attain them. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think this goes also to Matthias, Martin, and Christian, I would say. Christian, can we start with you? When we talk about standards, where do you see your priorities and the focus points?
Maybe best to start with the institutional investor on this, because I will have a biased opinion. So maybe Martin first.
All right, Martin.
Yeah, so for us it's binary. So either we have the highest standards or we don't go in. So that is really like from the get-go. If we don't implement proper standards on the ground, like this is nothing where we could compromise in any sort of way, which is also why capacity building, TA facility work is quite crucial. So also that's something we do. We do it within Africa Grow, but we also work on it with the Emerging Market Climate Action Fund. So we need to enable the local project developer also to implement those standards without risking the whole operation. But there is no way around high standards.
Matthias, yes.
I fully agree with that, what Martin said, but maybe just I would like to add one thing. Of course, from a political point of view, for us, an initiative like the Global Gateway Initiative and the Build Back Better World Initiative is, of course, also a vehicle in order to spread out, to bring abroad our shared values. And this is fully in our interest that we find another vehicle in order to have an alternative to let me say it like this, to the dragon in the room, of course. And this is completely in our interest then.
And Christian, your short note on that?
Sure. Look, that has been the whole purpose really of Fast Infra, which started under the One Planet, but which has really become, I think, one of the leading initiative in that, on that front, is to really come up with best practices in terms of standards. And again, mapping with QIIP, with Blue Dot Network, with all the frameworks out there, and continuing the dialogue, because I think it's really important to have some type of harmonization, especially in terms of sustainability standards, environmental standards, climate resiliency, and coming up with something which will facilitate due diligence for investors, coming up with something which will provide market reassurance on asset quality and sustainability for investors, and something which can be done at scale. So where we, we leverage a little bit like CBI, the Climate Bond Initiative, has been mentioned, and the Green Bond principles have been mentioned. The Green Bond principle has been a very successful tool because the market now is over $1 trillion, more than $300 billion a year of issuance. So we want to create the same standard which will allow to attract investor and the same quality of standards. So with obviously safeguards in terms of greenwashing to prevent some possible abuses on that side. But I think it's going to be a critical tool.
Thank you, Christian. I would go on with the next question. Last round. The gentleman in the middle section had another question. Thank you very much.
Thanks. You get 2 American questions in a row. I'm Andrew Herskowitz, the Chief Development Officer at DFC. The U.S. government's development finance institution. So there are 3 major obstacles to investment in infrastructure that nobody mentioned, except although Martin just mentioned capacity building. One is political will, and political will encompasses a lot of things, including predictability in a market, political courage to make changes that we see in a lot of countries. Second is capacity, and capacity is both experience in the sectors in a lot of these markets, as well as the bandwidth for the countries themselves to have the people who can implement the infrastructure projects. And the third is currency, whether it's the ability to repatriate currency or currency being managed in a way where you can predict what the impact is going to be. Can you choose any one of those 3 topics and talk about what you're doing to address it, or what you think we, as government, should be doing to address any of those 3 issues?
That's a perfect last round. Thank you very much for this idea. We start with Matthias. Which one would you choose, and what are you doing to tackle these obstacles?
I think the question of capacity building might be one of the 3 topics that you mentioned that I think we could also develop further ideas on that in our B7 community on that. So because I was also listening to my colleagues here and to the virtual colleague, because they also gave me their interesting information. So I think this might be in our community one of the largest point of interest, how to foster capacity building.
Thank you. Martin?
Also capacity building. So this is also something we see by backing local GPs, and how they then work also with government, which then in turn shapes also political will, because that's then based on examples and the local developers setting up power purchase agreements which are then bankable on the back of being properly and patiently financed with equity. And this is why I would also choose that.
Dashan, which point would you take for your last point?
Capacity building seems to be the theme. Andy, thanks for the question. Look, I would say NDCP, so the NDC partnership, from a climate perspective, is a route into how do we convert the NDCs from COP26 into sensible investment plans moving forward. How do we support governments locally with the capacity to kind of develop their own NDCs, and then over time convert them into financeable programs. So that's one very real area that CPI is quite involved in from our perspective. In terms of currency, my only thought there is it is incredibly important to how we're unlocking domestic resources. Providing local currency guarantees, as Garanco does under the PIDGE set of facilities, is the type of intervention that we would like to see more of. We would like to see better supported by a wider cross-section of DFIs and MDBs. And then if I could, just circling around Jürgen's comment on, can you split single country or do you go wider? I would just say it's very hard to invest in, lower than BBB minus. And that inherently gives you a kind of, okay, so how do we get more exposure to countries and businesses which are located in locations where that's the case? And I think it's a very good point. If you want to go from billions to trillions, and there aren't very many good examples of billions, then you do focus where there is the depth of capital market to allow that type of interaction to take place. You don't go and try and run it in a more limited space. Thanks.
Thank you. Coming back to Christian on the obstacles, capacity building,
Yes.
political will, or currency, which one do you choose and what do you do against it?
I will choose the three of them. I will go very, very quickly on, I was going to mention Garanco, which was done, so I'm not going to go there again. Investment roadmap, I think, is critical, and I'm really encouraged to see much more of that coming, with impulse from chief funds. On de-risking tools, I think it's really important to distinguish between concessional finance and the de-risking instruments that multilateral developments can provide. And I think, and not only multilateral development banks, but DFIs and DFC, for instance, as this breach of contract tool, which I think is very, very promising. So I think the scaling up and of de-risking instruments that can cover FX, but also some political risk is critical by MDBs. And that's not concessional, that's a de-risking. Last thing I would mention on capacity building, the key partner of the Sustainable Infra label has been the Global Infrastructure Facility. And that's exactly what they do. They do project preparation, they do capacity building, they work with the countries, they are partners of CFLI in India and Indonesia. We need to scale up their resources because they play, I think, a critical role in making infra projects more bankable.
Thank you, Christian. And last but not least, we do have Felix Fernandez-Shaw from the European Commission with us in the live stream, and he also has a question, as I assume. Hello and welcome, Felix. What's your question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Very good. Thanks a lot for putting all these people together. I do have plenty of questions, but that would be for a minute.
Maybe we start with one question because we are ahead of the coffee break. But one question would do it.
But I've got my coffee here, so anyway. No, thanks a lot. I wanted to. I think we are in front of some representatives from these countries where I think the panel has been talking theoretically about what to do, where to do. I've seen some of the questions, including Jürgen's question on whether we can focus in a country, in a sector and de-risk. I was wondering, and then this idea that we can only invest in those, what is it, BBB minus, above BBB minus, I think you just said. We are working here in the European Commission with the new financial instrument to work on green bonds on both sides, on the issuing side and on the investing side, trying to encompass and guarantee and de-risk all these issues that we've just spoken about, technical assistance, capacity building, currency exchange, and see if we can promote together a big package to come in support of green bond issuance by emerging markets and developing economies. And my question is, to the people that are there today coming from the countries that the German presidency has invited, what would you tell them? Because it's very good to have this overall conversation about a market, about a number of places, but I see Senegal, I see Indonesia, India, etc. What do we tell them? What do we expect? And what can we offer them if we go, for example, to offer them support and de-risking to issue a green bond that the global investing market can support?
Thank you, Felix, for this last question. I do see no one responding. Dashan, maybe you can give us a glimpse of what is...
I can say a couple of words.
Christian, yes, then go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll just mention a couple of initiatives which have been launched by the IFC. They set up a series of funds to promote investment in green bonds in emerging markets. They did a couple with Amundi, one with HSBC, which was focused on corporate bonds. So it's really the idea of putting together a pool of money, which will be institutional money, that will be dedicated to investing in emerging market green bonds, coupled with technical assistance from the IFC to encourage and to help sovereigns from emerging countries put together the necessary framework for green bond issuance. So I think that's a very successful tool. Again, scalability has been an issue. It's only, I think, altogether about $3 billion, maybe a little bit more than $3 billion. So not a huge amount, but I think pointing in the right direction in terms of the potential public-private collaboration for the development and acceleration of green bonds in emerging countries. So there are tools that exist already, but more needs to be done.
All right, thank you very much at this point. Christian, Varshan, Martin and Matthias, thank you so much for joining. We stop here. We continue in the coffee break for conversations. I mean, there's a lot of food for thought, but we have a little bit, 2 more panels coming up. So thanks again, and we see each other again. I'm a little bit generous. 4:25. Let's make it 4:20, and then we see each other here 4:25. So you have a coffee break, which is not only 10 minutes. Deal? All right, see you in a bit.